Today on the podcast, we'd like to welcome Colonel Ajai Shukla, who was in charge of one of India's most storied regiments. Post-retirement, he took up journalism and was also a war correspondent in some of our neighborhood's hottest regions.
In a sense, sort of when you're in the army, fundamentally to a layperson, for someone in the army, it's imperative to listen to high command, it's imperative to listen to orders. And then you made the shift to being a journalist. And in a sense, at least to me, a journalist must question power, must question authority. Why the switch, and how did you make that switch?
Well, these are two questions. I'll first talk about why I made the switch and how it happened. When the Kargil war was going on, I was one of the operations officers in Kashmir who was conducting the operations and so on. And every day we would sort of work till 2 or 3 at night and then come back and groggily sort of have a few spoonfuls of dinner while we were watching the TV. And it struck me that the TV coverage of that war was completely different from what was actually happening on the ground. There was no sort of similarity whatsoever. And I was wondering, what are the people of this country going to learn from this war if we're not even sort of accurately reporting it? So when the war was finished and things were settled and done, I wrote to New Delhi Television. I wrote to Prannoy Roy, and I said that, I've got to thank you for rallying the support of the country behind the military, and that was very useful for us. But I've got to tell you that your correspondents need to be educated on defense. But Prannoy is the man who takes instant decisions. He said, fine, then leave the army, come and join us. And I said, no, I'm going to command my regiment. I was commanding a tank regiment called Hodson's Horse. I said, only after I finish this assignment will I think of doing anything else. Because it's the high spot of your career as a military officer to command your regiment. And eventually I went and joined him.
I just caught something. You said, when you guys were sitting in Kargil, you felt like the reporting wasn't, in a sense, what you all were experiencing on ground level.
Right.
Any example of that or anything that you really felt like, okay, after seeing this, this is completely at odds with what is happening?
Well, what was happening and what was being reported was the viewpoint of a set of journalists that had gone to Kargil, that were functioning from Kargil, but which was still some distance away from the battlefront. So they were really reporting a sort of a perceived reality. And what was more evident than that perceived reality in Kargil, where the fighting was going on, was what was happening in the home villages of the people who were martyred and who were coming back, and their funerals attended by politicians who were looking to make a sort of a public relations killing from it. In some cases, genuine sort of affection for the people concerned. So that was really the difference that I thought needed to be bridged, because those people who were up there fighting were fighting as a consequence of blunders that had been carried out by other people before them, which had allowed the Pakistanis to come in. Nobody addressed that question. To the best of my knowledge, it has not been addressed even today. So that was what I meant by, a perceived reality versus an actual reality, and the gap that needed to be bridged.
So I'm going to request us to go a little bit behind. And you said the history of Kargil had a huge impact on the result that was the war. You joined the army sometime in the late 70s, early 80s. What was it like? I think for a lot of us now, that seems like a really, really long time ago. What was the world like? What was the army like? What was India like at the time?
It was sort of very much a small set of industrialists, which were called the Bombay Club, you would recall, who had cornered the licenses and so on, and were therefore in control of the production as it happened. So India had limited resources with which to play around with the military force. But even with that, you would recall that in 1971 we had fought Pakistan, we had liberated Bangladesh, we had created essentially a new country, which is a huge military victory. And the army was still bathed in that afterglow of the victory in 1971. But it was not an afterglow that lasted very long, because we just live in a neighborhood where, as one wag put it, there are fewer neighbors and more hoods. And India was at the ready. The military was always ready for internal security problems, problems from Pakistan and China and so on. So, given all things, I sort of looked at my father and said, "Dad, I'm going to follow you into service." And that's what happened.
You think it would have happened if everything was 30, 40 years from now? So I think another way to ask that question is, there are so many more options now, and you think the Indian Army or armies in general will have a harder time getting recruits moving forward?
Well, there are, this is an interesting question. There are two distinct sort of streams that we're talking about here. One is the officer community. The other is the community of what they call persons below officer rank, the Jawans, the fighting force of the military, as it were. And, there was always a problem getting enough people who were willing to become officers, because they had very high standards at those days for selection, and not everybody met those standards. Whereas in the Jawan community, India is an agrarian economy. It's a country of its villages, and there were always people ready to join the army. So you had to sort of reconcile this difference. A lot of Jawans available versus very few officers available. And it has still not been, I can say, entirely. We still hear of this Atmanirbhar community. All of this is designed to sort of make sure that there are as many officers as there are Jawans who are willing to fill those difficult posts in the army.
In a sense, I did my undergrad and my postgrad from America. And if you watch American TV or if you watch American TV shows, there is a glorification of the armed forces almost to a commercial degree. And that's how they get people to join. Is that something you think? Because I've always found that, and that's probably to the credit of the Indian Army, is that, maybe there is no glorification beyond what is needed, or no glorification that comes outside of the actual act of liberating a country and so on and so forth. But how would you, or what do you think are the ways that we could solve the officer-Jawan disconnect?
I see it as a situation where there is both good and bad. You do want a certain degree of glorification. Armies suffer from neglect. When people don't pay attention to it, they don't get enough manpower of the right kind. They don't invest money in modern weapons and so on. So that's the sort of part of the army which I would call very difficult, and which needs to be focused more in these macho films that you actually see.
And so when we look at these kind of movies, for me, one of the only times I felt compelled or felt like joining the army was a movie. There's an old Hrithik Roshan movie called Laksh, where the music and the climbing and you get out of that movie and you feel you want to contribute. But then the Bombay club business person takes charge. You kind of go on and kind of live your life. But in a sense, what you mentioned, I've always found interesting because the Indian Army works in or is stationed in some very interesting places, right? Oftentimes, friend and foe and countrymen and location is all within the same 5-10 kilometer stretch. And I don't know if many other countries have that. So if you're stationed, and I was reading whether it's Kashmir or whether it's the Northeast or whether it's on the China border, how do you differentiate? How does the army differentiate between citizen and foe, between where you are, between being a friend or effectively a police force versus doing your duty as an army force?
That's a sort of a situation that we grapple with almost every day. You're right. You sort of are conflicted in your role as a military, which by definition is outward looking and designed to protect the borders of the country rather than people within the country. And then you have the police and paramilitary forces, which are not so much outward looking as they are inward looking.
And to that extent, and you've been a significant part of this, how are we doing?
I think all things considered, India has done really well. It's managed not to lose much territory. China is the one example which sort of shows the vulnerability of India. The territory that they've captured in eastern Ladakh. In 1962, they came in all the way up to Tezpur. So there is this sort of constant reminder of the need to be alert and so on. But there's also a reminder that we have managed without external help, without any country calling us their ally or their sort of subordinate country, the way United States and Pakistan have related to each other. So we've done much better than them. And there's a downside. It's very sapping for morale, for the number of troops that you have engaged constantly in duties. But all things, I would say, 9 on 10.
I'm going to use a little bit of a sports analogy. And in a sense, sometimes when you're only defending in a test match or as a football team or as an American football team, it's just a release to go on the attack for a bit. And it seems as a civilization or as a country, we've had just 1,000, 10,000, 5,000 years of purely defensive, inward-looking planning. At least, again, as a layperson, that's what it looks like from the outside. Has that held us back? Has the fact that India almost never invaded anybody, never thinks of invading anybody, or am I wrong? Have we done some of that?
I would say you're both wrong and right. You're right in that we have adopted a strategic defensive concept.
But that goes beyond the formation of India. I mean, it seems to go, thousands of years.
Yeah. It goes back in history.
Yeah.
But you have to look at it from where we are today. And when I went to the line of control for the first time, it was absolutely striking how every Indian post, you would see a signpost over there, a little memorial, well sort of tended to by the soldiers serving there today, saying things along the lines of, this is in memory of 43 soldiers of the Gurkha Rifles or the Sikh Regiment or whatever, who laid down their lives recovering this post for India. And it strikes you that we're only recovering the post for India. We are seldom going out and
and not that anybody is advocating for war, but the reason I ask you that is because kind of one of the things you mentioned at the start of the conversation as well was that the afterglow of Bangladesh was there for the army to see. It's one of our sort of highlights from an army and from a country standpoint, and that always seemed to me to be an aggressive act to cause a country to split or to pick sides, let's say.
I would say a reputation is more important than sometimes a sort of a fact on the ground, and to that extent we're not doing badly.
So to that end, we're trying to become a export hub for weaponry or for military exports, right? And I was reading somewhere, actually one of your articles, that we've kind of gotten to 22,000 crores of ammunition and arms exported. Just wanted to understand your perspective on A, is that something we should be doing? And B, does the reputation we have actually help us in that regard when you deal with other countries?
Yeah. Your question would best be answered in looking at it as a sequential manner. The bottom assumption, the foundational assumption that I would say is that India requires to produce its own weaponry for reasons of cost, for reasons of scientific development, for reasons of technological skills, for reasons of battlefield advantage. India needs to develop its own weapons. But developing its own weapons requires a user for those weapons.
Yeah.
And therefore, the Indian military must, I believe, do more to absorb the weaponry that its own defense establishment makes, and to therefore sort of provide an economic rationale in terms of economies of scale, in terms of ensuring that buyers are available, in terms of maintenance into the future. All these things must also be serviced and taken into account. So the bottom line is that India has to do more to absorb its own defense weaponry, and to sort of therefore put money into the pockets of its own producers rather than French producers and German producers and so on.
So the money topic is interesting because if you look at the one military industrial complex that we have, which is the one in the United States, that is extremely profit making, and that is fundamentally primarily driven by private enterprise, and in almost a symbiotic relationship with the country. So it's private in its profit making, but almost semi-private in its demand. And you read again a little bit of what we read about the kind of products being produced. Not all of them are useful, but it's a complex. It's a military industrial complex. Can we achieve our goals without creating an Indian private military industrial complex?
So I would say that the US defense industrial estate is not serving the national objectives of the United States. 85% of its output is going back into the US military and is therefore being paid for by the US taxpayer. And therefore, you have to have a different model where either a lot of that production is absorbed by other friendly countries, or else, you cut down, make it far more cheap to produce, and not put such a large proportion of the US, $850 billion. That is the expenditure of the next 10 largest countries.
And I believe 9 are allies.
And 9 are. But, just for one enemy, China, you cannot warp the defense production model and the industrial model of an entire.
So whose models should we be emulating, if any, or does this require like a page one rewrite of how to generate a sustainable military production system for your country?
It's a very difficult way to do things, because selling abroad, exporting weaponry, perforce builds up another power as users of the weaponry. Now, you're also trying to reconcile that, because you're trying to be the biggest power in the world itself. So how do you reconcile selling a lot of weaponry with not making somebody else powerful? So it's, I think some countries like Germany, like France and so on, have got a model that is slightly more sustainable by a simple sort of virtue of selling a larger amount to a country or countries that are not necessarily going to be hostile to you in the future. But this is a very difficult question to answer, and it's a very, very tight rope to walk.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody has got the answer right so far.
And in a sense, kind of what's happening, at least when we read it, a lot of these countries are going to have to figure stuff out as America decides whether to secure all of its allies or whether to have them pay for their own security. And I think that may, at least from the outside, it looks like that may change now how they deal with some of these questions as well.
It's, look at America and Pakistan. Let's look at one sort of relationship that is right there in our faces. Pakistan and Pakistanis in general feel that the United States has exploited them, has taken advantage of them, has pushed them into a corner where they had no choice but to resort to terrorism and sort of a completely antithetical measures of that kind. While America believes that it's doing Pakistan a major favor by sort of sending them weaponry at cheaper prices. Now, this is not a sort of an outcome that anybody would welcome, where both sides of a deal are convinced that the other side has made a fool of it, has gypped it, and has taken advantage of it.
Yeah.
It's the same with China and a lot of the other small countries in Africa that it's been selling weaponry to. They all believe China is gypping it and forcing it to spend more on weaponry. It eventually boils down into a war, into an argument against war between countries. But so far, I don't see a good model that suits both sides, and that yet does not result in, outbursts of violence and so on against each other. First thing is that there is a certain advantage in building technology for technology's sake.
Okay.
Which means that not to apply that technology to a sort of certain obvious outcome, but to have it in your kitty and being able to apply it to a range of other outcomes that may not be immediately apparent. Like China, for example, got all kinds of fancy material technologies like ceramics and steel, nickel steels and so on for their railway system. But before you know what, it's equipping your missiles and so on. So I think that, there really is no clear model that India can emulate. We have a dire need for high technologies, not just for railways, which we just spoke about, but for hypersonic weapons and so on. And hypersonic weapons, it's got to be remembered, serve an extremely useful outcome. And that is to be able to strike the enemy at speeds and at interim speeds where that enemy cannot block it, cannot stop it, and essentially it goes uncontested. So it's also required for space exploration. It's also required for ballistic missile defense and objectives of that nature. So, you would be very hard pressed as a defense planner to say that I will do this technology because it provides me more immediate gains than a similar rival technology. Comparing technologies is one of the most difficult things in the world. And that's how one of our sort of greater objectives, which was to sort of impose offsets on defense production, never really got off the ground because we were never able to assess which technology we want and which technology we then leave behind.
In your avatar as a journalist, any interesting things that we're coming up with? Anything you've read, private or public, that you think, okay, this stuff that India is doing is genuinely sort of on the cutting edge, or is worth looking at, and if this kind of progresses, it gives us something very useful in whatever security we need over the next 5, 10, 15 years?
Yes, definitely. There is a sort of, I will speak about groups of technology. There is materials technology that India sorely needs. We have individual weapon system productions. For example, jet engines, which are not coming on stream. You've heard of the Kaveri engine fiasco, because we do not have the right material technologies to build those engines.
So there is a reverse engineering part for sure, and I think everybody does it, right?
And there's no reason why we should not.
And to a huge degree, and again, I'm going to use some sports analogies, but to a huge degree, that's how sports moves forward and people move forward. You get coaches, you get people from other sides, you learn and you build on it. So there's a reverse engineering part. But I also meant the main development part of it, which is to say that we don't actually have enough people doing research and compensated for doing research. And not only in this field, I would say, so I'm in real estate, in the real estate field as well. A lot of what we do is coming from elsewhere. We don't have access. So my question is that something you think the army can help in and push along, or is that only the purview of education institutes and private players to kind of push research along?
Well, I think that first of all, don't mix the army up with this.
Yeah.
The army's job is to fight.
Sure.
The army's job is to train to fight and to use those weapons and technologies to their best advantage. But the actual production, the actual manufacture, the actual scientific origins of that material is done by organizations like the DRDO, like the ordnance factories and so on, not by the army.
Yeah.
So these organizations, especially the DRDO, have in the last 4 or 5 years really achieved creditable success in tying up exactly the kind of partnerships that you allude to, which is with IIT students, with scientific universities, with the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, with the Atomic Energy Commission, and they have actually got going a very creditable bunch of outsourced development. So it's exactly what you're referring to, but it's made a beginning. It's made a sort of creditable beginning, and while it might be difficult for students abroad to be thinking in terms of coming back, though China has adopted that model very successfully, Indians tend to do their PhDs abroad and then stay abroad and make new lives for themselves.
But in many ways, there's two aspects to it. There's a money aspect to it, which is what it is. but there's also a love of the research or a love of a subject aspect to it.
Yeah.
And when I have spoken to people who have decided to stay back, a lot of the frustration comes from the inability to do the research, or the inability or the inaccess to the kind of resources they would need to do the research here that they would get in a country like the United States or France or Germany or any of these kind of places. And so maybe a secondary question is it time in a way that we have 8 or 10 or 15 IITs? Do we need 10 or 15 DRDO universities or institutions with the express purpose of getting some of the smartest and people before they leave, or even as they leave, and give them access to resources that for security purposes or otherwise you may not be comfortable giving. I'll give you an example. I went to the University of Illinois, and a few years before I was there, they had access to like a little nuclear reactor.
There is also the beginnings of what you're referring to and recommending that are evident in the Indian context as well. We have a problem with security classification and export controls and the other sort of framework of rules and regulations that require sort of tying up before a government sort of organization will be open to the idea of private organizations coming and dabbling in those sciences. There's always this fear that, but there'll be information leaks and it will sort of result in sort of technologies being stolen by our adversaries and so on. There needs to be a little less paranoia in some of these dealings. But at the same time, I will also say that there needs to be a good network of rules and regulations that let this whole thing hang together without any leakage of technology. I think that the space program has indicated that we are well on our way to sort of developing these sort of network of rules and regulations. But I think that the sort of urge to close ranks and keep technologies protected is something that still has some way to go.
Yeah, two thoughts come to mind. I think first we should have a bunch of stuff that we should want to protect, right? I think sometimes the first step is to create enough that people who want to steal it.
Absolutely.
And the second, and I often think of this when we discuss hacking and computer security with people, is that no matter what you do, is that possible? Is it possible for a long enough time to keep technology hidden or secret?
And add to that the sort of urge of some organizations to protect the knowledge that they don't have any knowledge.
Correct. Does that still hold true? Do you need weapons for World War III? Do we need weapons for the next war?
Oh, well, the sort of question that is being asked by a lot of people is not whether we need weapons, but do we need the kind of kinetic weapons
correct.
currently employ? The answer is yes and no. I think that a lot of the reportage that has taken place on the Russian-Ukraine conflict which was presaged by the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, and which future conflicts will 100% use to a far greater degree than these. But I don't think these have the ability or the potential to sort of blow up the world, as it were.
Yeah.
It's not. It just produces an option or a range of options that allow small unmanned systems to deliver high-impact weaponry onto sort of an adversary which is not prepared to deal with those things. So I think that bows and arrows are still some way off, but so too are the use of nuclear weapons. I mean, all kinds of things have been predicted from this Russia-Ukraine conflict. The death of the tank has been predicted for the 455th time. They keep predicting the doomsday of certain technologies, but to actually sort of find a replacement, then sort of find a way to do away with the use of those technologies is not so easily done.
And to the technology point, you mentioned that we have 2.5 fronts. In a sense, do we need an army for the third part of that, or the 3.5 front, which is the cyber front? Are we remotely as equipped as we should be? And again, you read all these things about how power lines and power supply and all this kind of technology that we consume can be attacked and shot. And so do you need a different branch of the military to just look into that?
You don't need a different branch of the military. You need a cyber command of the kind that you talk. Then you need a space command,
which America seems to have started. Yeah.
I mean, we're well positioned in some of this stuff. We've not gone into it in a concerted manner the way that the Americans do, but we're not completely lacking either. So this is all going to come into the ambit of the joint theatre commands as they are rebuilt or as they are created. Right now, we have not done anything by way of this joint theatre commands. We've got a chief of defense staff, but that's only created the tools with which we will then go on to create the theatre commands. So far, we're sorely lacking, I think.
And in a sense, what is the cause of that? Because like a famous prime minister of ours said, governments come and go, things move, right? There's certain things that remain or should remain permanent. The army is one of them, because in a sense, without that, there is no country. And like you said, our neighborhood is very kind to us, and so they're always trying to remove some of those pesky borders that we've set up. What is, despite the issues that India has faced, I would say over thousands of years, why don't we have the kind of urgency that we need to set some of these things up? Should we not be at the forefront of some of this?
I think that we are very harsh on ourselves in sort of evaluating this and apportioning blame. Let me take you back to 1947. What was India at that stage when, the Indian flag was unfurled for the first time and Jawaharlal Nehru made his famous tryst with destiny speech? We had no space program, we had no defense production, we had no scientific universities and technology institutes. I think we've come a really long way, all things considered. Nehru had, for every rupee that had to be spent on science and technology and nuclear sort of destructive technology, was 1 rupee less on defense, on healthcare, on education and so on. Reasons that have more to do with the internal politics of that country than with us. Our real problem is China.
Yeah.
Our real threat is China. And if by removing Pakistan from the equation, we will be far more better equipped and sort of be free of the encumbrances in dealing with China. We have, for 70 years now, we have sort of created this myth and this fiction that China is our real enemy and Pakistan is not. And why I now call it a myth or fiction is because when we've been spending or deploying 2/3 of our army against the Pakistan threat and only 1/3 against China, how are we saying that China is or that Pakistan is a minor threat and China is a major threat? Now this is changing. We had recently raised 2 divisions for the Arunachal Pradesh front. We have raised a full strike corps that would be deployed largely against the Chinese front. So now we have more of a balance, more troops deployed against China as compared to Pakistan. The results have been apparent. China's military's rhetoric has significantly been toned down since these sort of deployments took place. Pakistan may be taking advantage, the Pakistan military may be taking advantage of the Indian bogey, I will call it, in justifying its hold over its own country. But at the same time, there has to be some truth in this for India to actually give Pakistan that bogey to deploy.
Yeah.
We would be much better off milking more troops out from the Pakistan front, deploying them against China, giving the Pakistani generals some satisfaction in actual point of fact, even though they may not immediately acknowledge it, that India has de-escalated against them. So we in many ways, we shape our own battlefields, We create the conditions in which we will be fighting or in which we are going to get into a tension-filled situation. And in that, we have not been very good.
Is that, in a sense, due to our own public perceptions? And so, you ask someone on the street or you talk to somebody walking around, and ultimately we're a democracy. And the perception or the threat level, because of the asymmetric nature of Pakistan's threat, when we were in the city, when, attacks happen in Bombay. And so all of that is in our psyche, especially anybody who lives in Bombay or India as a whole. And in that sense, China is, it's an analogy almost like drinking and smoking, right? You smoking long term obviously is worse for you, but by the time you realize what's happened, you're maybe 50, 60 years into smoking, you drink a lot the next day, it's a bad thing, everybody yells at you, right? And so in a sense, the China threat seems to be a lot slow burn. And it's not immediately apparent because there is no, I haven't lived through, in a sense, anything directly impacts me that comes from China attack-wise. And I've lived through multiple examples, stuck in my house and so on and so forth in my formative years of threats that then are attributed to Pakistan.
Well, yes and no, I would argue. China, its threats are not very apparent or in your face, but the threats such as they are more serious ones in the long term. Your cigarette and smoking example, I would not know since I'm a teetotaler and a non-smoker. I would say that in positioning these threats and in reallocating the resources needed to develop those threats, you can actually shape the way that they play out. And the Pakistan threat is also, you remember, so in your face and so apparent, partly because of our own domestic politics. The reason why I strongly back the F-35 as an aircraft that India needs is because Pakistan, China, uses Tibet as a geostrategic shield that puts the Chinese mainland out of range of a lot of India's fighters. Now, if you use a Jaguar, which is our other ground strike fighter, the Jaguar has a significantly long range compared to some other aircraft, but it still does not have the range to go hit the Chinese mainland and come back. or if you tell the sort of Air Force commander that we need you to cut off the Tibetan railway line into China and to interdict the two road highways into China so that we have the Tibetan target. So we're sort of isolated and can deal with them. The answer will be that we don't have aircraft with the range to do that. The first day of any war between India and China has to be devoted to the Indian Air Force knocking out the Tibetan railway and the two highways. Then you roll up your sleeves and say, now let's get the Chinese in what we do.
What's the importance of Tibet? Why?
The importance of Tibet, first of all, is because it's just a geographical buffer between India and China that India has to cover in its aircraft or its missiles before it can strike any target on the Chinese mainland.
And if they have access to the highways or the railway lines that you have mentioned, what advantage does that provide them?
It allows them to move troops into Tibet and build up the defenses in Tibet.
And from Tibet to India as it currently stands is much easier, I presume.
The Chinese can do it from Tibet. They can't do it from mainland China. First of all, it's not just the geographical distance, but it's also the fact that you are in Tibet taking off from airfields that are at altitudes of 10 to 12,000 feet.
Got it.
And that reduces the bomb payload and aircraft payload that those aircraft can carry by half.
Got it.
So you really want to get the Chinese into a position where they are forced to defend Tibet, not just because it's in proximity to India, but also because Tibet itself will be simmering and smoldering and longing to throw off the Chinese yoke, and at the same time, strike the targets and prevent Tibet from being reinforced by the Chinese army.
And in a sense, a war being fought 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now, would it be fought with such contemporary weapons? Russia, Ukraine is a recent example, but in general, would future wars be fought over territory, you think? Or there are other aspects to it?
You can fight a war for multiple reasons, including some ideological reasons in many cases. But you will always fight the war on terrain. You will have the enemy deployed in several areas. You will have to develop the means to strike those areas. And at the end of it, war is quite a simple business. It's the business of knocking out the enemy's capabilities while retaining yours. China is very good at that, and it's very adept at using it at short notice. To wit, the Vietnam conflict of 79. But they still have this major vulnerability. We talk about half a front threat for Kashmir. The threat in Tibet and Xinjiang for China is a lot more than half a threat. It's a full-fledged 1.5 threats once those two sort of restive provinces actually start coming into the game.
And to that end, how much of a deterrent is something like the Quad or something like Japan, Australia, India kind of coming together? Is that purely China focused then?
The Quad is not China focused, it is America focused. It's it provides the US with a lever that it can apply against China sitting in the United States for the most part. But the important point here is that India while being a member of the Quad and while being able to benefit should the Quad actually be ever called into action, faces two big questions then. The first is it going to act as a part of the Quad? So far, India has never displayed any inclination to act as part of an allied sort of force. Apart from that, apart from being able to act as a Quad, India is the only member of the Quad that has a land border with China.
Correct.
So China can apply force to India in two theaters, the maritime as well as the mountain, whereas India can only apply, if it does at all, practically half a front force against China. Now, this is a good 100 kilometers of border, 110 if I remember correctly, which has never been described, never been sort of drawn up on a map, and to that extent, not amenable to be legitimately claimed by either India or Pakistan. So when you have something that cannot be legitimately claimed, you claim it with the use of force. And that's exactly what India did. It moved troops onto the glacier. It was an absolute feat, a Herculean feat of mountaineering to do so, because if you're carrying sort of just your packs as an infantry soldier and walking along in Siachen to your post, you're already 3/4 of the way to exhaustion. It is the most hostile battlefield in the world because you're panting for and gasping for every breath you take. You're looking down to see if there's any indication of a crevasse into which you could fall at any given time. And on top of that, if there is an enemy post to be captured, it's always uphill and it's always next to impossible to do. So India's sort of feat of mountaineering, I will use the word feat, is sort of an understatement of sorts.
Like you train for something like this? Or you just have to find out?
Where are you going to train?
That's my question. Like, how was that managed? What are the kind of challenges that you see or don't see, and how do you manage to kind of create a plan for that?
Well, the plan was very simple. The plan was to lift Indian troops in helicopters, 2 soldiers at a time, put them at the feet of or at the base of the Saltoro Ridge, which is a north to south running ridge that protects the Siachen Glacier from Pakistani side. When you have built up enough troops, a platoon, 36 people, you can then move them up to the Saltoro Ridge and sit there. And at those altitudes, the guy who's sitting on the hill and forcing the other person to come uphill towards meet him can just pick off those people one by one with great sort of care and concern, because they've got all the time in the world to do it. Those people who are climbing and assaulting uphill are just so exhausted by the time they reach halfway that they sort of will use any excuse of the Indians are already there to sort of call off the operation. And that's what was done. For 2 years, Pakistan kept trying to sort of dislodge India from the Saltoro Ridge. It was a wasted effort. They just ended with a lot of casualties and a lot of failures to report. Whereas India has sat down, India has occupied Siachen. I should mention also here, just a technical point, it is not the Siachen Glacier that is in dispute. The Siachen Glacier is entirely in India's control. It is a ridge line west of the Siachen Glacier called the Saltoro Ridge, which protects and shields the Pakistanis from... the Pakistanis cannot even look at the Siachen Glacier. because there's the Saltoro Ridge on which the Indians are sitting. So we've developed great expertise in high altitude mountain warfare, and Pakistan has unfortunately taken a lot of casualties.
And in a sense, I'm sure you've met people who served at the ridge. What does that take? What we're all very comfortable here. Can you put us a little bit into the minds of someone who's there? How long does that last? How many days do you have to be there? How do you survive that?
You survive that by pure mental toughness. There are people who don't survive it. There are people who sort of go into crevices. There are people who are mountaineering. This is not high altitude fighting. This is mountaineering. It's higher, the lowest peaks in Siachen or the highest peaks in the Alps, the Swiss Alps, are not as high as some of the posts that the Indians sit in Siachen.
I have sort of two thoughts on this, but my first question is to that point, what are the sort of allies that you think we will need moving forward? And I've heard you mention France, but just, if you can give us whether you still believe that, what are the advantages of that sort of friendship or that sort of ally? What can that help us do?
I don't think that any country is going to take our side in a war with China that we initiate or we sort of
of course,
trigger in some way. Nobody wants to take on the big guy. And France and Germany and the UK and the US, Australia, New Zealand, all these fancy groupings, the Five Eyes as they call them, and the AUKUS now as they call it, they are there to basically protect against a certain form of aggressive Chinese behavior, but not on the Himalayan front. India itself believes that it will have to fight its own battle in the Himalayan front. So that's a very sort of telling statement in which we are basically tying our own hands and feet behind our backs and hoping to take on a sort of a very large neighbor with extreme power and malign intent. So I think that we will have to do a lot of rethinking on this. It's one thing to deal with it in terms of a small intrusion into Ladakh, and even that became into a sort of a crisis that was threatening to spiral out of control. But when you're talking about full-fledged conflict and war, then it will be a sort of a grave situation that India will have to tackle with the help of others.
And there's a little bit of an optimist in me that when you look at Europe and the EU and their history, and in a sense the advantages of creating a common market, you would hope that sort of Asia or our part of Asia can reach that, right? Because a lot of the maturity of those European countries 500 years before this was just fighting. It was constant fighting between France and Spain and the UK, and they figured out a way to kind of go from there to where they are now, which is in a sense a more united front. So that's kind of the more optimistic part of me. When you started in the 70s, did you have any aims as to what you're going to do in the army, or was it just, like you said, you got in and then you just took it as it came about?
In the army, there's, at least in the Indian army, there has to be a certain attitude of a sort of bravado and we'll take it as it comes. You don't get much of a say, I'm talking of as an officer, in where you're going to get posted next, what kind of terrain is it. It could be the jungles of the Andamans, it could be the high altitude terrain in China, it could be the deserts of Rajasthan. We've got a variety of places to sort of test the mettle of a young officer. And it builds a certain bravado and a certain feeling that come what may, we'll deal with it. We are capable of dealing with it. And, you meet some of the most cheerful Indian Army officers in some of the most cheerless places. And they're serving with pleasure, they're enjoying themselves, they found a meaning to their lives, and what else can one sort of hope from a profession?
And you mentioned that before you change professions, you've got to take charge of the Hudson Horse unit. Were you aware of the history of the unit? Did that play a part in why you wanted to kind of take that, or it could have been any unit, it didn't matter?
This is a subject we will not.
All right, fair. In terms of what you are doing now, which is the press, and I think as we've been growing up, a lot of us, I think we've seen trust in a lot of these institutions erode. We've seen people ignore it. We've seen people not believe anything they read. And I think there's a tremendous amount of confusion between what is journalism and what is opinion. And to be honest, I don't think anybody's aware on both sides of the camera. Is that something you notice from your end as well? And is that something that is fixable where we are? When they started allowing news networks to make profit, I think that was a huge aspect of when their news information or the quality of the news information started changing. And so you had very respected anchors sort of way before I was born, but when you read news, you hear the Cronkites and stuff like that, and they've not been able to replicate that. An anchor of such repute that if they said something, people assume that it is news. Is it ever going to be possible to go back to that era? How do we get out of the era where currently, just fragmented information everywhere? I wouldn't even call it news.
Well, remember, America went through a sort of learning process as well. This war of the Spanish succession, the sort of oft-quoted example is of Howard Hughes, who sent a person, a correspondent there, and he needed a war, he needed something to report. So his correspondent, after 4 days of drinking, told him, sent back a message saying, "There's no war here, shall I come back?" He says, "You supply the pictures, I'll supply the war." From there, the United States has developed into a sort of what we would today call a mature sort of reporting environment, where the Washington Post or the New York Times is something where they say something, only Trump will sort of get up and completely knock them off their pedestal.
Does a lack of libel laws hurt us? So if you compare it to the Europeans or the UK or whatever, where provably false information has no negative?
There are sort of libel laws and there are libel laws. In some cases, a libel law cannot be invoked unless it is proven that it was spoken with malign intent or written with malign intent. In others, the libel laws have to be sort of, you have to give the other person a chance to get their viewpoint. So, libel laws or a set of libel laws that impose good order on a correspondent is an absolute essential. But it's not there in most countries right now. I mean,
most countries don't have the challenges I think that we have, just in terms of the nature of the beast, the kind of people, the variety of people that we have. So that's always struck me as a question that I would love to get more people to answer, whether there is any accountability that we can generate so that people have more trust in the news. I'll give you a real estate example. By creating the Act RERA, it actually helped a lot of developers because it generated more trust for that project to come up. And people can get into the pros and cons of that, but the very fact that something existed, it's the same in Dubai as well. The very fact that they created, and the Dubai market it's a deterrent, it's information. And I've always wondered, considering the amount of news channels we have, the amount of newspapers we have, magazines, and not everything is read, blogs and podcasts, whether sort of a trust set or a set of laws that create more trust is net good and can be used.
It's at the end of the day, it will always boil down to how it is used. A set of laws can be as good as as you can visualize them, but imposing them, ensuring that the news organizations act in conformity with them, that's something which is we run up against the same problems that we're running up today.
So on that front, I'd like to thank you so much for taking your time off and coming here. For anybody that wants to read some amazing articles, Sir has a lovely website, www.ajayshukla.com, and it's called Broadsword After the Weapon, as well as Sir can be found on Twitter or X at the rate of Ajay with an I, Ajai Shukla. Thank you so much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.